Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Personal Protective Equipment for Abrasive Blasting. We're glad that you're joining us this morning. My name is Josiah Lockley, and I'm with JPCL and Paint Square. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is organized by SSPC, the Society for Protective Coatings, and JPCL, the Journal of Protective Coatings and Linings. This webinar is part of our 2017 SSPC JPCL webinar series. You can find more info about the rest of our schedule by visiting www.paintsquare.com/webinars. Now, before we begin, let's take a few moments to talk about the format for today's webinar. The presentation by Tom Enger of Clemco Industries will be lecture style and last roughly 45 minutes. This will be immediately followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. There you'll have the opportunity to submit questions via the questions chat box that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're having any technical issues, you can also use this box to send questions of that nature, and we'll do the best we can to address them if anything comes up. For those who wish to receive continuing education credits from SSPC, a test is available immediately following the webinar. Cost of the test service is $25. You can register by visiting the SSPC Marketplace at sspc.org/marketplace. We will repeat this information at the end of the webinar and in a follow-up email. Actually, you know what? I left a little bit of the stuff out. I don't want to jump over too quick. One thing to keep in mind with the SSPC webinars is that they are an accredited training provider for the Florida Board of Professional Engineers. And if you're interested, you can download and submit the FBPE form along with the completed exam from, again, sspc.org/marketplace. And again, we will repeat this information at the end of today's webinar. The presentation slides are currently available for download at paintsquare.com/webinars. We are also recording today's webinar, and we will make it available for replay in our archive by visiting paintsquare.com/webinars. Keep in mind, it may take us up to 4 to 5 hours after the conclusion of today's webinar to have the archive updated. So I would expect to see it the recording most likely around 5 p.m. Eastern Time today. Now, before we begin, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Tom Enger. Tom Enger is Director of Product Safety for Clemco Industries. He's a certified safety professional with over 32 years of environmental health and safety experience. His resume includes heavy construction, explosives manufacturing, government affairs, and for the last 16 years, abrasive blasting. He has published articles in JPCL and has given training seminars at SSPC conferences covering several abrasive blasting safety topics. He currently works for Clemco Industry Corps as Director of Product Safety and as a safety resource for end users of Clemco products. Now at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tom. Okay, Tom, we can see your screen, so take it away.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to this SSPC webinar. My name is Tom Enger, and I'm one of the several employees at Clemco responsible to assure our users are able to provide a safe workplace for you and your employees. This webinar will assist you in understanding the personal protective equipment associated with abrasive blasting, along with associated regulations and consensus standards. This webinar will assist you in understanding, oh, I think I read that. At the end of this webinar, you should have a general understanding of the proper personal protective equipment required when abrasive blasting or when you are in the zone of influence around the blasting operation. We will also touch on the regulation and consistent standards which mandates or sets best practices. Throughout this presentation, you will see several website references in which you can refer to after this webinar for additional information. Before we jump into the personal protective equipment required for abrasive blasting, along with any bystanders which assist these operations, let's spend a few moments to understand why we embrace a culture of safety. The first reason we often hear is that it's the right thing to do. Talking about safety is like talking about motherhood and apple pie. Who can be against it? However, for those of us who work directly with first-line supervisors and craftsmen, we also know better than to challenge them about their knowledge or commitment to safety. Talking about a company's implementation and knowledge of safety is as taboo as talking about their profits or their salaries. Enforcing safety simply because it's the ethical thing to do is great, but by itself, it does nothing to address the systemic problems of poor safety performance. We also hear that it's the law. OSHA was established in 1971. In 2015, there were over 75,000 OSHA inspections, resulting in fines of over $143 million. That's about $2,000 per inspection. These 75,000 inspections were performed on over 4 million regulated employers in the United States, which places the employer's chance of being inspected this year to about 1 in 50, or about 2%. Put these two facts together, as a risk manager will tell you that each employer has a 2% chance of being fined $2,000. So the cost of having a poor safety program when it comes down to being fined by OSHA is about $40 a year. Not a really scary penalty for having a poor safety program. So why should we have an active safety program? Because it makes good financial sense. Without looking at the loss associated with damaged equipment, time off work, breakdown in production, and employees diverted from their jobs, looking only at the loss associated with your workers' compensation insurance is reason enough to embrace a positive safety culture. For example, on your screen shows an employer who moved from a program with a high loss to retention ratio. That is, they spent more money on workers' comp than they paid in their insurance company. Over the course of the years from 2000 to 2005, this company's premiums increased almost $600,000, or about $100,000 a year. When this company implemented an active safety program, their premiums went down over the course of the following 3 years by almost $70,000 per year. Because worker comp premiums are based on the last 60 months or 5 years, this illustration does not really show you the full savings associated with an active safety program. But you certainly see every time you have an accident, you find yourself through your insurance premiums. This one fact alone should wake you up to seeing that developing a culture that embraces safety pays. But how does a small company begin to build a good safety program? Well, there is help. There are consultants that can come and build a sustainable program. Ask your suppliers for help. A reputable equipment or material supplier should be able to provide free advice and support for integrating their products into your safety programs. This is not the kind of support you get from website sales, but from a supplier in your industry. Make it a habit to only buy from manufacturers or suppliers that support their equipment after the sale. Now, on to who says I can't blast this way. There is a cornucopia of regulations, rules, codes, and standards which provide guidelines and practices to assure your employees as well as the public are safe. These are known as regulations, standards, or consensus codes. Every organization, government, or private entity uses these in their totality. There's not a single regulation, standard, or consensus code which completely covers everything we make, do, or sell. They are written to be used together. Knowing only OSHA standards is not enough to assure an effective safety program. The best method when implementing these standards is to start what is known as with the primary reference document. In the case of employee safety, that is 29 CFR, commonly known as the OSHA regulations. These regulations incorporate and reference a multitude of other standards. The primary regulations, which incorporate other standards into the OSHA regulation, is 29 CFR 1910.6. This, like all regulations, can be found on the OSHA website, osha.gov. Remember, even if it is not written in the OSHA regulations or the standards the regulations might reference or incorporate, there is always the general duty clause, which simply states, if you know there is a hazard, you must mitigate that hazard, whether there is a standard or not. This same general duty clause also mandates every employee shall comply with all rules, regulations, and orders pursuant to the OSHA Act. So just to be clear, safety is a two-way street. While the employer has an obligation to assure they provide a safe workplace, every employee is equally responsible to follow all the work practices, wearing of personal protective equipment, and actions which assure safe work environment for themselves and their fellow employees. OSHA puts out a publication covering protection for abrasive blasting. It can be found at the address shown at the bottom of this slide. The first step in determining the proper personal protective equipment, commonly known as PPE, is the job hazard analysis. OSHA mandates in their regulations that if personal protection equipment is required, a job hazard analysis, or JHA, must be performed for that job. Now, there are many kinds of job hazard analysis, but OSHA has provided a simple one which you can do. You can find this job hazard analysis on the OSHA website by either searching for job hazard analysis in their search box or by going to the address on the top of your screen. In 2008, I performed a complete job hazard analysis for common abrasive blasting operations. This job hazard analysis can be found on Clemco's website under the Safety tab or by going to the Clemco Industry web address on the top of your screen. These job hazard analysis requires you to break down your job into tasks or activities, identify the hazards associated with that task, and then their control and their associated PPE. The final column in this slide was added and is not required, but it enables the users of this job hazard analysis to find the primary reference document that provided the information in controlling that hazard. This is only a sample of the total job hazard analysis, which can be found on the address on the top of this screen. There are a multitude of OSHA regulations which apply to proper safety precautions and PPE when abrasive blasting. While we do not have time to go through each one, this illustration will assist you when looking for primary regulations. You can go to the SSPC website and download this presentation to review this slide, or to go to Clemco Safety tab and download the article containing this illustration. After you perform a job hazard analysis, you will notice that there are many sources of toxic and hazardous substances in the form of inhalation hazards. These hazards originate from 4 sources. The first is the surface being treated in the form of the coating you are removing, predominantly in the form of dust or particulate matter. The second source of inhalation hazard is the abrasive you are using. As of September 23rd of this year, the new silica standard is fully enforced, is fully enforced in construction and general activity. While we don't have time to cover this new standard, I want to warn you that if you are still using sand, this new regulation significantly impacts how you train the blaster, protect other employees in the work zone, monitor both the workplace and the health of the exposed employees, as well as record keeping. If you are still using sand, you need to read this new regulation. Many slag abrasives, such as coal slag, contains trace amounts of beryllium. As of the end of May of this year, OSHA has reduced the permissible exposure limit of beryllium to 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter. Implementation of this regulation has been delayed until May 20th to accept and review additional industry comments. If this new regulation goes into effect, it will be just as restrictive as the new crystalline silica standard. Other abrasives, such as metallic shot or grit, as well as organics, also have significant inhalation hazards which need to be addressed prior to beginning blasting operations with these abrasives. The third inhalation hazard is the air that you breathe in your respirators. Standards for compressed air quality can be found in the Compressed Gas Association Standard G7.1 or in 29 CFR 1910-134I. Finally, the solvents and the fuel you use to maintain your equipment will present specific inhalation hazards. The permissible exposure limits for these inhalation hazards can be found in Subpart Z of the General Industry, Shipyard, and Construction OSHA regulations. These regulations may be found on the web at OSHA.gov. While these slides show many of the potential air contaminants which pose inhalation hazards to the blaster and workers within the zone of influence, it certainly does not contain all the possible hazardous substances blasting operator employees may be exposed to. Base metals such as carbon, stainless, and galvanized steel, as well as aluminum, copper, nickel, and other alloys, produce air contaminants in the form of aluminum, cadmium, chromium, copper, iron, lead, magnesium, nickel, and zinc. Abrasive blasting media is often the primary source of the inhalation hazard. Media such as coal, copper, and nickel slags, steel grit, garnet, glass, and sand expose blasters and bystanders to excess amounts of arsenic, beryllium, crystalline and amorphous silica, cadmium, chromium, lead, magnesium, nickel, silver, and titanium. The exposure of these hazards exists whether you are dry or wet blasting. Do not be misled by demonstrations, videos, or written materials which show blasters not wearing the proper respiratory protection. While most constant flow supplied air respirators endorsed for abrasive blasting have a manufacturer's proof they exceed a protection factor of over 1,000 and therefore meet the 1,000 APF rating accepted by OSHA, it is the bystanders which often are exposed to high levels hazardous dust, which exceed simple dust mass. It is very important to know the level of the hazardous substance in the air, which may harm the blaster as well as those in the zone of influence. Now that we have laid the foundations for the regulations, standards, and consensus codes, as well as the omnipresent inhalation hazards associated with both dry and wet abrasive blasting, let's look at the minimum personal protective equipment required by the basic job hazard analysis we discussed earlier in this webinar. This webinar will address 9 hazards requiring personal protective equipment associated with abrasive blasting. They include respiratory protection, eye and face protection, head protection, hand, foot, hearing, rebound protection, fall protection, and temperature extreme protection. OSHA provides a plethora of publications to assist in the development of an effective EH&S program. All these may be found on the website listed on this slide. OSHA publication of PPE can also be found at the website listed on the second address on this slide. Let's start talking about the first piece of personal protective equipment you see around abrasive blasting. That is the constant flow supplied air respirator endorsed for abrasive blasting. These two types of constant flow supplied air respirators, there are two types of constant flow supplied air respirators, the type C and the type CE. Type C supplied air respirators are mostly used in the surface coating industries as painting respirators, known as hoods. Normally these are Tyvek hoods with a constant flow air supply. The type CE supplied air respirator, similar to the one shown here, is used in abrasive blasting. It consists of a hard plastic helmet and a cape capable of resisting rebound abrasive. There are 2 primary reference sources you should acquaint yourself with. Both of these are found in the OSHA website, OSHA.gov. They are 29 CFR 1910-134. Both the Maritime and Construction Standard direct you to this general industry standard, and the NIOSH Respirator Selection Logic publication, which assists in the selection of the correct respirators. These regulations and publications provide the employers information on site and medical monitoring, training, record keeping, and written program requirements when a respirator is required. Constant flow supplied air respirators endorsed for abrasive blasting are described as loose-fitting respirators and do not require quantified fit testing. NIOSH still recommends an assigned protection factor of 25 for these loose-fitting supplied air respirators. However, OSHA has allowed an exemption, allowing an APF of 1,000. However, OSHA specifically states in 1910-134 D3IA, the employer must have evidence provided by the respirator manufacturer that testing of these respirators demonstrate performance at a level of protection of 1,000 or greater to receive an APF of 1,000. Absent such testing, all other supplied air respirators with helmets or hoods are to be treated as loose-fitting facepiece respirator and receive an APF of 25. This proof should be found on the manufacturer's website. If you do not have this proof, then your supplied air respirator only has an APF of 25. These Type CE respirators begin at the point of attachment, which consists of a regulator, gauge, and pressure relief valve. In this photo, you can see the gauge in which the yellow air hose is connected. The yellow air hose, the air regulating valve on the belt, black breathing tube, and helmet are all part of the respirators. These components must be purchased from the manufacturer of the supplied air respirator. They cannot be mixed and matched from other manufacturers, and aftermarket parts cannot be used as replacements. These include the outer, intermediate, and inner lenses of the face protection part of the helmet. The requirements for breathing air used in supplied air respirators can be found on the OSHA website. Simply stated, OSHA requires breathing air to meet the Grade D requirement as described in the Compressed Gas Association Manual G7.1, except it must have instead of low odor, it must have no odor, and it must be dry. This additional requirement is often met by using the red particulate filter shown in this slide. This particular filter also enables the employer to meet the OSHA requirement of providing a sorbent bed filter. The red filter shown in this slide is not part of the respirator and can be interchanged with other type of absorbent bed filters. Most of the absorbent bed filters are similar to the ones shown, and most manufacturers of supplied air respirators also make these filters. These filters do not make Grade D air. They only remove odors, oils, and mist from the air. They are not magic boxes, and you must provide Grade D air to these filters. Finally, before we move on to other personal protective equipment, it is important to mention all breathing air supplied by oral lubricated compressors must have a carbon monoxide monitor to ensure the air does not exceed 10 parts per million of carbon monoxide. The regulation also states you must assure the wearer of the supplied air respirator is receiving Grade D air. OSHA normally requires annual testing of breathing air. This can be done by contacting air testing companies that can be found on the web by Googling breathing air testing. This testing costs approximately $100 per test. The final respirator subject I would like to quickly cover is the issue of when a Type CE respirator is required for abrasive blasting. You may have all seen demonstrations of blasting techniques called vapor, slurry, or wet abrasive blasting, in which the operator was wearing a dust mask and a face shield, or some other negative pressure respirator and a face shield. As a safety professional, I wrote the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to request an interpretation letter on the requirement of wearing a Type CE respirator while performing vapor, slurry, or wet abrasive blasting. In short, OSHA stated that unless the employer can prove through testing that the wet blasting operation does not exceed any permissible exposure limit, the blasting operator must wear a Type CE respirator, commonly known as a blast helmet. This letter of interpretation can be found at either of the sites listed on this slide. By not using a Type CE respirator when abrasive blasting, whether it is dry or wet, you are placing the operator at risk and are violating OSHA regulations, unless you have proof you are below the permissible exposure limits. While personnel around abrasive blasting are not required the type CE respirators that we have been talking about, if the area they are working in exceeds the permissible exposure limits, these employees must wear a respirator with an assigned protection factor high enough to protect the employee, and are also included in the Respirator Protection Program. I would like to remind everyone who uses sand or coal slag as an abrasive that OSHA has already changed the crystalline silica permissible exposure limit and may, by the end of May, change the beryllium permissible exposure limit, which is found in trace amounts of coal slags. These changes in the PEL levels may require a respirator greater than the APF that is typically assigned to a dust mask. Also, dust masks with a single band are not respirators. They do not protect your workers against dust. These single band dust masks are often called comfort masks. Do not use these types of masks when you are in the zone of abrasive blasting. Also, remember, if you wear a respirator just once a year, then you are included in the OSHA mandated respiratory protection program. Okay, now let's move on to other types of personal protective equipment required while abrasive blasting. Most of the more common type CE respirator on the market provide both hard hat and face protection. Head protection, meeting ANSI Z89 standards, are common for the hard shell type CE respirators as shown. However, this type of helmet only meets the ANSI hard hat rating if it has the Z89 stamp. This Z89 stamp may be found on a sticker located inside the helmet or molded into the helmet itself, depending on the manufacturer. Face protection, meaning ANSI Z87 standards, are also common for type CE respirators. And again, the Z87 stamp or imprint must be on the lens or adjoining structure holding the lens. This Z87 imprint is found on the inner lens, usually under the gasket seal. Most abrasive blasting helmets have an inner and outer lens, and several have an intermediate lens. While the inner lens by itself could meet the requirements under Z87 as primary eye protection, when added to the intermediate and outer lenses, the light deflection no longer meets the clarity requirements as primary eye protection, commonly known as safety glasses. Most of these helmets meet the Z87 requirements for face protection. OSHA does not mandate the use of both safety glasses and face protection while abrasive blasting. However, it does require the employer to determine the most effective protection while blasting. Now, my guess is both face and safety glasses is more effective while blasting. A good guide for eye and face protection is the one listed on this slide put out by the International Safety Equipment Association. Remember, responsible manufacturers will have these ANSI conformance tests available for the end user, and many have them on their websites. Most abrasive blasting operation requires rebound protection from the abrasive and substrate being blasted. The proper type of gloves should be thick enough to withstand this type of harsh abrasive environment. In most applications, hand protection against solvents is not required. There are many glove selection guides on the internet. However, most deal with protection against solvents. OSHA recommends gauntleted leather gloves that protect the full forearm. Foot protection is also required and must meet ANSI Z41.1. These are commonly known as steel toe shoes. Most steel toe shoes now have a composite toe protection which meet the ANSI standard. Coveralls do not only protect the worker from abrasive rebounds in many cases, such as removing lead or primers containing hexavalent chromium. They are required in a donning and doffing program are also required to protect against hazard. Substrates which may impregnate the employee's clothes. More commonly found in the desert and northern regions, temperature extremes must also be considered. In these environments, you will see employers issuing climate control vests, which operate using a climate control valve powered by compressed air. Inhalation hazards. Inhalation and hazardous substance and noise are two of the most chronic hazards associated with abrasive blasting. In my 35 years of safety experience, I have noticed workers are using the Type CE respirators more and more and don't have to be reminded that they are being exposed to hazardous dust. However, I still see a significant number of blasting operators and bystanders still either not wearing hearing protection or improperly wearing hearing protection, especially the foam air plug. All hearing protection is rated by using the ANSI standard S12 1.13. There are even abrasive blasting helmets with noise reduction ratings, which often are used as secondary hearing protection to the primary hearing protection of foam air plugs or muffs. Every package containing the hearing protection must have a noise reduction rating on the package. Normally, you will see a number followed or preceded by the word noise reduction rating. An example of this label is on this slide. The final piece of personal protective equipment I would like to cover in this webinar is fall protection harness. Year after year, fall protection is the most issued OSHA citation. Falls are the #1 cause of work-related deaths. Over 1/3 of all work-related deaths are because of falls. While the abrasive blasting industry works very hard to warn against inhalation hazards associated with abrasive blasting, which is important, it is falls that injure and kill more workers. Anyone working over 6 feet must not only wear fall protection harness or have other fall protection, they must be trained in the proper use of the harness and be held accountable by the employer. As I stated, fall protection is the #1 cited violation by OSHA. Scaffolding-related violations is the 3rd most cited standard. And as a point of interest, ladders are #6, and fall protection training is the 10th most cited violation. These violations related to fall protection represent over 50% of all OSHA violations. Employers and OSHA recognize the loss associated with falls in the workplace and has published a multitude of brochures, standards, quick reference cards, and videos to assist employers and employees to reduce and eliminate the risk of falls in the abrasive blasting industry. There are several website addresses on this slide which can assist you in developing an effective fall protection program. Now that we have covered the primary personal protective equipment used in abrasive blasting, I want to take a moment to quickly touch on other hazards and associated regulations and standards that commonly apply to the abrasive blasting industry. OSHA has written regulations on the blast machine, blast hose, nozzles, and the pot itself. We don't have time in this webinar to cover these issues, but I just want to introduce these requirements just to make sure you are aware of them. Confined spaces are also a significant hazard in abrasive blasting, and this standard, while not covered in this webinar, should be considered prior to entering any structure or enclosure that is not normally occupied. Several of these are listed on this slide. This webinar also, while it only discussed PPE and touched on a few other safety standards, don't forget there is also an environmental consideration. The environmental impact of abrasive blasting is a subject for another webinar, but I just want to make you aware that they exist. And I think I'm done. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do actually. Thanks again, Tom. I just needed a moment to unmute my microphone, but yeah, we do have some questions, and I want to invite everyone to use this opportunity now to also, if you have any additional questions for Tom, now's the time for the Q&A session. If you'd like to submit a question, please enter it into the questions chat box located in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There, we'll select questions to read aloud for Tom to answer. Time restraints and content restraints may prevent us from reading and responding to all questions in the session, but all the submitted questions are logged, and we'll do the best we can to follow up with responses to them in the weeks to come. So with that in mind, let's take a look and see what we have here. Let's see here. Who is responsible for inspections and enforcement in abrasive blasting operations?
Well, it depends. OSHA, in any civilian activity, OSHA has a right to enter the property and do safety inspections for OSHA compliance. They're always responsible, but many contracts requires an inspector from an outside agency to come in and inspect, and that's usually written inside the contract before you enter. So if you go on a government base, usually they will have on-base inspector that will do safety inspections. If you go on a nuclear site, they will not only have OSHA, they will have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission come on, they will have the contractor safety professional come on and do inspections. But OSHA is responsible overall for most abrasive blasting operations as far as comes to safety.
Is there a checklist for using PPE for abrasive blasting operations?
Not that I know of, but that's a good idea. We should make one of those. That's a good idea.
Okay. All right, this one just came in right now, and it's asking if you could go into a little bit more detail in regards to foot protection, like such as steel boots, or steel toe boots, I should say.
Okay, OSHA requires you to do a job hazard analysis, and at minimum, you're going to have to come up with steel-toed shoes. But I think a good case can be made for metatarsal protection. It just depends on how you write up your job hazard analysis and you look at the hazards. You know, if you have a danger of something falling on your metatarsal, you would also require metatarsal protection. But as far as rebound abrasive, either your a heavy pair of pants or your blast suit would take care of rebound protection.
Would you recommend wearing a leather apron to protect against rebound media?
The problem with wearing a heavy apron, you get a lot of stuff behind it, you know, and that kind of rubs on your clothes and makes you itchy and makes rashes, things like that. Usually a coverall is the best choice when you're looking for protection against body protection against rebound.
Let's see here. We're getting them coming in at a pretty good clip, so I just want to thank everybody who is sending in questions. A question that we do get every webinar is how do I find a copy of today's webinar? And it's a very, very easy answer. Go to paintsquare.com/webinars. There you'll find a copy of today's slides. They've already been posted to the site. And as I'm looking right now, we are recording today's webinar, and we will post it to the site this afternoon, most likely at the very latest around 5 p.m. Eastern Time, if not sooner, depending on all sorts of interesting things. So here's some other questions that are coming in here. This attendee is noting that they see videos and demonstrations of wet blasting systems where the operator is not using a blasting helmet, and they want to know whether this is okay or not.
I see that all the time on YouTube and stuff like that, and it's wrong. It places the operator at undue risk. Unless they're doing industrial hygiene study for that operation, and they can prove that their permissible exposure limit is below that their exposure is below the PELs, they have to use a type CE respirator. That's what OSHA says in 1910.94, and that's what the letter of interpretation says. You must prove you're below the PELs. You just can't assume it. You must prove it. So basically, unless you're doing your industrial hygiene studies, you have to use a blast helmet.
Okay. Can you test your own breathing air?
Yes, you can. Most of the time you do. What you do when you go to these air testing is they'll send you a sampling unit, and you sample the air, and you send that sample back to the testing company, and they'll test it for you. But, you know, grade D air is a funny thing. You know, everyone kind of wonders what grade D air is, and grade D air is actually the air you're breathing right now. That's what grade D air is. Your compressor takes grade D air and compresses it and sends it through a line. And what happens to that grade D air in that compressor is what most people worry about. Do you have oil burning that creates carbon monoxide? When it condensates, when the pressure changes in air, it will condensate and you'll have waters, vapors. When you don't change out your filters, you get mold and things like that. So things that the mechanical operation of compressing that air and sending it through the line is what we're most concerned about. But grade D air is the air you're breathing right now. That's all it is.
Okay. What is the reasoning that this person wants to go into a little more detail, wants you to go into a little more detail in regards to the reasoning that you must use the same manufacturer's equipment for respirators?
Because every respirator, NIOSH comes and audits every respirator manufacturer at least once every 2 years, and they have to have a quality control manual to assure that respirator is made and safely operates. And all the components associated with that respirator is inspected by NIOSH at least every 2 years, if not every year, depending on who you are. You don't know how certain parts combine with other respirators. They're not tested that way by NIOSH. And so NIOSH has sent a letter out that specifically states you must use all the original equipment manufacturer parts for respirators. I go out in the field all the time and I will see a whole mismatched bag of parts for supplied air respirators. You got to pick a supplier and stick with them.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions here that are sort of all based around the same topic, and I'm going to do my best to. I guess the best thing to do would be to sort of combine them into one question here, but we've had a couple people that want you to go in a little more detail about the beryllium rule and what is happening with it.
You know, this is kind of funny. Co-slag really only has a trace of beryllium, just a trace, and there have been several anecdotal studies done using co-slag to determine beryllium exposures, and sometimes those anecdotal studies show that they're below 0.2 micrograms per cubic meters, and sometimes they're shown to be above 0.2 micrograms per cubic meters. And this worried a lot of people because if this beryllium standard is lowered to 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter, it's going to pull in all sorts of regulations that you don't normally have to comply with. Under the Trump administration, they have delayed all new government implementation of new standards for 90 days. And that's what they did in this case. They delayed it for 90 days, which is May 20th. To allow people to make comments and help justify or modify this regulation. I haven't heard anything about what's going on as far as what the industry is doing to either improve or modify this new regulation, but I will keep track of it. And as of May 20th, on their website, I checked it yesterday, it still says May 20th, this new beryllium standard will go into effect.
Okay, we hope that addresses some of the questions that people had about that. In relation to that, we are logging these questions, and Tom, I'll direct these over to you afterwards.
Yeah, if you give me those questions and an email address, I'll be happy to send it out, send them an answer.
Just so we're clear, a lot of these questions that are coming in are in relation to the idea of, beryllium versus other abrasives as well.
Oh, beryllium's a big subject right now.
Oh, yeah. Let's see here. Let's see what else we have in terms of, questions that have come in here.
I have to tell you something, Josiah. This beryllium thing, everything you blast with is dangerous. Everything you blast with have an inhalation hazard. And you have to protect yourself against whatever that hazard is. And you should always be concerned about the OSHA regulations, but you really have to be concerned about the health of that worker. And you have to say to yourself, What am I blasting with? What are the hazardous constituents of what I blast with? And how am I going to protect that worker from that? You know, outside of what the OSHA regulation says, doesn't matter whether you use steel grit or whether you use sand or coast slag or anything else. They all present their own unique hazard, and you must protect that worker from that, and you do that by using a Type CE respirator.
Okay, another question that's come in here is, if you're 6 feet above ground, do you have to wear a harness?
No. If you have guardrails, adequate guardrails that have a top board, a mid rail, and a toe board, or if you have approved scaffolding systems that also have the right fall protection on the scaffolding system, or roof standards have a 10-foot standoff, flagging standoff that they use, but you must have some fall protection program in place once you get above 6 feet.
Do you have to wear a suit, or excuse me, do you have to wear a blast suit to blast?
No, you don't. But a lot of times that blast suit is going to protect you against hazardous substances getting on you or your clothes, especially if you're blasting primer that has hexavalent chromium, or you're working on a bridge deck, removing lead paint. All those require clothing protection, not only from rebound protection, but from the hazardous substances that you're removing. And that's when you need those type of coveralls. But I tell you what, I've worn out my share of blue jeans by not having a pair of coveralls, and I strongly suggest that you use them, or you'll be buying new jeans every week.
All right, here we go. Here's another one that just came in. What happens if the equipment fails to protect against a direct impact from the hose, such as when you lose control? Or let's see, they're following up with, or when the hose is still discharging the pressure, is the company liable for the accident?
The standard says that the blast nozzle must be held manually open by the operator. And so if you notice that all blast nozzles, they should have, in my experience, the vast majority have them, they have a trigger that the operator has to hold down. Now the ball and chain is not approved by OSHA yet, but so only that handle trigger that you see on most nozzles have to be held down by the operator. Now in more cases than not, I see the operators strap that trigger down with either a Velcro tie down or a snap tie or something, and that's against regulations. You have to physically hold that open with your hand. If you let go of that blast nozzle should stop.
Okay, here's a somewhat similar question here. What is the frequency of testing abrasive blasting hoses, and at what pressures?
Well, you're supposed to do a daily inspection of your blast hose every day, and if you look at the owner's manuals for the blast hose that you have, it'll tell you how to inspect it. But most of the time, it's a field test. You can feel the softness in hoses, and they're supposed to be inspected daily before each work shift.
Okay, let's see here. Should blasters use steel lanyards when wearing fall protection gear?
I've never seen a steel lanyard using fall protection. I'm not really sure what he's asking.
Okay, well, we have time for maybe a handful more questions, so I would encourage the person who sent this question over around like 10 minutes ago if we have time, to please go into a little more detail what you mean, if you can expound on it a little more, and we'll try to tackle it if it comes in within the time. All right, here's a follow-up question to one of the earlier ones that was asked about, improper demonstrations of wet blasting systems where they're not using a helmet, and they're just asking about what's with the frequency of it.
I think because wet blasting significantly reduces the amount of dust that's generated by blasting. It does. It significantly reduces it. However, it does not reduce it below the permissible exposure limits in most cases. And so people perceive that it's okay not to wear a respirator because they don't see all that dry dust floating around. But inhaling a wet particle is just as harmful to your lungs as inhaling a dry particle. And when we did, there's been some studies done by NIOSH, and Clemco has done some in-house studies on wet abrasive blasting, and they all come up above the permissible exposure limits. And that's what you have to test for. There's some test out there that says, oh, you significantly reduced the dust by this much, but they don't tell you what the PELs are, or what how much per how many grams per cubic meters that they're exposing the workers to. I've seen some where some of the tests are below and some of the tests are above. And if some of the tests are above, you have to wear a respirator. I don't like wearing respirators any more than the next guy, but you can't put that worker at in harm's way. It's not a responsible way to act.
Okay. Question from earlier that we didn't get a chance to ask. Are CO monitors downstream of the filter required to be the same brand as the respirator?
No, the CO monitor is not part of the respirator. Now, Clemco has a CO monitor that goes inside the helmet that has NIOSH approval to go inside the helmet, but you can place your CO monitor anywhere in line of your Airstream. Okay,
and here's the follow-up to the question about the steel lanyards, and this will most likely be our last question. So the attendee expanded a little more and just said that in response to you, welders use steel lanyards when welding at a certain height. Does the same apply to blasters to prevent damage to lanyards?
Huh, that's a good question. I get, a lanyard could be made of anything. It has certain performance criteria requirements. It's got to hold a certain force, a certain sun and force, and it has to have a certain shock absorber criteria to it. It doesn't have to be nylon, doesn't have to be fiber rope, doesn't have to be steel. It has to meet these performance requirements for lanyards. They can make it out of anything. But it has to meet these performance requirements. So I guess someone came up with steel lanyards, and they meet those performance requirements. I just happen to never see a steel lanyard. I've never seen one. But when you think about it, it makes sense. You're not going to blast a steel lanyard the same way you're going to blast a nylon lanyard.
Okay. You know what? One more question here. It is the this is one that was also asked earlier. We sort of touched on it a little bit. Is there a reference for frequently asked questions on the new silica standard?
I think OSHA has one. If you go to the OSHA website, I think they have an FAQ.
All right, excellent. So with that, we're going to wrap today's Q&A. I want to thank everyone for sending in all the questions. We didn't get to cover every single question. Some of them referred to other questions that we had. But again, we logged the questions, and we'll send them over to Tom afterwards. So before we wrap up, though, there are some final topics I do want to cover with everybody before we wrap. So with that in mind, for those of you who wish to receive continuing education credits from SSPC, there is a short test through the SSPC marketplace. The test is $25, but is free for SSPC members. It can be found by visiting www.sspc.org/market-place. Upon completion, you may earn one continuing education credit from SSPC or from the Florida Board of Professional Engineers. The slides are currently available at paintsquare.com/webinars. You can also view a recording of today's webinar, again, by visiting paintsquare.com/webinars. We expect the recording to be uploaded to the site by 5 p.m. Eastern Time today. In order to find that information, again, visit paintsquare.com/webinars and click on the title of today's webinar, Personal Protective Equipment for Abrasive Blasting, and from there, you'll be able to access a copy of the slides, and once it's posted, today's recording. If you're not already receiving the PaintSquare News daily e-newsletter, we encourage you to sign up at paintsquare.com/PSN. There you'll see top headlines of protective and marine coatings, as well as industry news, selected features from JPCL, and other online features like problem-solving forums, coating quizzes, and weekly polls. Finally, on behalf of SSPC and JPCL, I'd like to thank Tom Anger for a very entertaining and educational presentation. And of course, all of you attendees for joining us. We look forward to presenting more webinars that will be educational and useful in your work. This concludes today's webinar. Have a great day, everyone.